In this episode, we are going to practice remembering, not just understanding, because the real world does not wait for you to look things up when something goes sideways. Spaced retrieval is a learning method where you repeatedly pull key ideas out of your memory across time. And that repetition is what turns knowledge into usable judgment. Artificial intelligence, AI, lifecycle risk work is full of moments where you must choose a control quickly, explain your reasoning clearly, and move forward without perfect information. When you can recall the right control choices under pressure, you reduce harm, reduce confusion, and reduce the chance that you will accept risk by default just because it is the fastest option. The goal is to strengthen your rapid recall of life cycle risk scenarios and the control choices that match them, so the concepts do not stay trapped in abstract definitions. As you listen, imagine you are being asked a question in the middle of a busy day, and your job is to respond calmly with a clear control choice and a reason that makes sense. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong place to begin retrieval practice is with the life cycle itself, because many mistakes start when people forget that a system has stages and that each stage has its own risks. Try to picture the full story from idea to retirement in your mind, not as a checklist, but as a sequence of decision moments. At the idea stage, you decide purpose and scope, which determines whether the system should exist at all and what it must never do. During design, you decide how people will use the system, what data it will touch, and how outputs influence decisions, which determines how safety and privacy are experienced. During data preparation, you decide what data is allowed, how it is cleaned and labeled, and how it is traced, which determines whether the system learns responsibly. During training and tuning, you shape behavior, which determines how the system responds when uncertain or under stress. During validation, you prove boundaries, and during deployment you turn those boundaries into reality with monitoring and rollback readiness. During operations, you watch drift, misuse, and incidents. And during retirement, you close the loop by deleting what should not remain and preserving what must remain for accountability. Holding this life cycle map in your head is the foundation of rapid recall, because when you can locate the stage, you can locate the right control family. Now practice retrieving what makes life cycle risk scenarios different from ordinary product risks, because AI systems can change their impact without changing their code. A common scenario is that the system becomes more trusted than intended, and that trust transforms a low-impact feature into a high-impact decision influence. Another scenario is that data use quietly expands because teams discover new sources and connect them for convenience, turning a benign tool into a sensitive data handler. Another scenario is that the system's behavior drifts due to data shift or concept shift, so yesterday's validated behavior is no longer today's reality, yet users keep acting as if nothing changed. Another scenario is that adversarial inputs exploit the system's helpfulness, causing it to reveal information or provide unsafe guidance. Another scenario is that vendor updates change behavior without your team fully understanding what changed, leaving you with stale evidence and a false sense of control. In each of these scenarios, the risk is not only technical, it is socio-technical, meaning it emerges from the interaction between the system, the environment, and human behavior. Your rapid recall goal is to hear the scenario and immediately think, what stage are we in, what risk is emerging, and what control family is the most direct way to reduce harm. Let's retrieve an early stage scenario, because early controls are often the cheapest and most powerful. Imagine a team proposes using AI to evaluate people, rank applicants, or recommend disciplinary actions, and they frame it as a productivity improvement. Your brain should immediately recall that high-impact use cases raise the bar for governance, because the cost of being wrong is not just inconvenience, it is harm to real lives and legal exposure. The control choices you should retrieve include narrowing scope, requiring cross-functional review, demanding stronger validation, and defining strict human oversight requirements. You should also recall that purpose limits matter early, meaning you must be clear about what data will be used and why, and what uses are prohibited. Another control choice is to define decision boundaries, meaning the system can support but not decide, and approvals are required before any output is used in a consequential way. You are not trying to memorize a slogan. You are trying to remember the logic that high impact requires stronger controls and stronger evidence. When you can say, "This is high impact, so we need deeper validation and stricter oversight before we proceed," you are demonstrating mature lifecycle judgment. Now retrieve a data-focused scenario, because many lifecycle failures begin with data convenience. Imagine the team says they want to use historical records to train the system, and the fastest data source includes sensitive personal details mixed with ordinary operational content. Your immediate control recall should include minimization, purpose limits, and data classification, because the safest sensitive data is the data you never collect or store for this purpose. You should also recall that data quality and fairness are tied to data selection, so you need to evaluate whether the dataset represents the real population and whether labels reflect what should happen, not only what happened. Another key retrieval is lineage, meaning you must be able to trace where the data came from and what transformations were applied, because without lineage you cannot defend or investigate later. If the data source includes secrets or regulated health-related content, your risk instinct should trigger stronger restrictions, possibly excluding that data entirely from training and even from retrieval. You should also recall that vendor involvement changes risk, because if data flows to a third party, you must control retention, reuse, and access. In rapid recall terms, you should be able to say, "This dataset is sensitive and mixed purpose, so we need minimization, strict purpose limits, and lineage before it can be used, and we may need to reject it for training entirely." Shift your retrieval to training and tuning decisions, because this is where teams often treat experimentation as harmless. Imagine someone suggests a quick tuning change to make the model more confident and more assertive because users like decisive answers. Your control recall should immediately connect assertiveness with hallucination risk and unsafe recommendation risk, because confidence without grounding increases the chance users will act on wrong outputs. You should also recall that training and tuning changes must be reproducible and versioned, because if behavior shifts, you need to know exactly what changed and you need the ability to roll back. Another retrieval is that provenance matters, meaning you must know what data influenced the tuning and whether it included sensitive content or biased labels. You should also recall that tuning can create trade-offs, where helpfulness may rise while safety falls, so you must test for safety failures explicitly, not assume improvement is universally good. A rapid control choice here is to require regression testing focused on known failure modes, such as hallucinations, privacy leakage, and adversarial manipulation, before the tuning is allowed into production. The point of retrieval is that your brain should not say, "Sure, let's make it more confident," but instead should say, "Confidence is a risk lever, so we must validate and regression test before we ship." Now retrieve the validation stage and practice the idea that performance alone is not enough. Imagine a model scores well on general tests, and the team wants to deploy quickly based on those numbers. Your control recall should include the triad of performance, robustness, and generalization, because a model that performs well on average can still fail badly under messy inputs or new conditions. You should recall that validation must reflect the use case, meaning tests should mirror real workflows, real data distributions, and real decision consequences. Another key recall is that validation must include safety failure testing, such as whether the system produces hallucinations as facts, whether it can be coaxed into toxic outputs, and whether it gives unsafe recommendations in high-stakes contexts. You should also recall that validation should examine segments, because average results can hide uneven harm, and a system that works for most but fails for some can create unfair outcomes. A rapid control choice is to delay deployment until validation evidence is tied to the specific version and configuration that will be released, because evidence that is not version-specific becomes outdated the moment a change occurs. When you can respond with, "The scores are not enough unless we validate robustness and generalization in our context and verify safety behavior," you are demonstrating real lifecycle recall. Move your retrieval to deployment, because deployment is where many programs lose control through rushed change. Imagine a release is scheduled, and late in the process someone proposes adding a new data connector to improve results. claiming it is a minor change. Your control recall should immediately connect new connectors with new exposure, because connecting to new repositories changes what the model can access and potentially reveal. You should recall that deployment requires change management, including clear documentation of what changed, who approved it, what tests were rerun, and what rollback plan exists if the change creates harm. Another retrieval is permission boundaries, meaning retrieval access must respect user permissions, and the model should not become a shortcut around normal access controls. You should also recall that adding a connector can increase prompt injection risk if the retrieved content contains manipulative instructions, so the system must treat retrieved content as untrusted data. A practical control choice is to postpone the connector change to a separate release so its impact can be tested and monitored independently, because bundling changes makes investigation and rollback harder. Rapid recall means you can say, a new connector is not minor, it changes the data boundary, so it needs review, targeted testing, and a rollback plan before it goes live. Now retrieve an operations scenario where drift shows up, because drift is one of the most common silent failures in production. Imagine monitoring shows a gradual increase in user corrections and a subtle rise in unsafe recommendation reports, even though the model version has not changed. Your control recall should connect this to data shift or concept shift, because the environment may have moved while the model stayed the same. You should remember that the response is not automatically retraining, because retraining can amplify risk if the underlying concept has changed and labels are now outdated. A better rapid response is to constrain the system, increase human review for high-impact outputs, and investigate what changed in the input environment and in the meaning of correct outcomes. You should also recall that monitoring must include both input signals and outcome signals, because drift can appear as changed data distributions or as changed performance against sampled ground truth. Another key recall is that segmentation matters, because drift can hit one workflow or user group harder than others, creating unfair degradation. Your control choice should be proportional and evidence-driven, such as narrowing scope temporarily while you revalidate and adjust. When you can say, this looks like drift, so we should tighten guardrails, investigate data and concept changes, and revalidate before expanding again, you are practicing the kind of calm recall that prevents drift from becoming an incident. Now retrieve an adversarial scenario, because attackers and mischievous users treat AI interfaces as a new surface to probe. Imagine you see repeated user attempts to get the system to reveal internal policy details, and those attempts shift from obvious requests to clever rephrasing and indirect prompts. Your control recall should connect this to abuse patterns, evasion, and prompt injection, because persistent probing indicates someone is testing boundaries rather than seeking legitimate help. A practical control choice is to tighten rate limits, monitor for repeated boundary testing, and ensure that refusal behavior is consistent so the attacker cannot learn from inconsistent responses. You should also recall that least privilege is protective here, because if the model cannot access sensitive sources, it cannot leak them, even if it is manipulated. Another retrieval is that logs and transcripts can become sensitive incident artifacts, so you must preserve evidence responsibly while minimizing additional exposure. Your response should also include treating this as a safety and security incident candidate, meaning escalation pathways exist and containment levers are ready, such as restricting high-risk features. Rapid recall means you can say, this is boundary probing, so we need to contain by limiting capabilities and access, detect patterns through monitoring, and improve defenses through adversarial testing and regression suites. Shift retrieval to privacy attacks, because leakage can occur even without classic hacking. Imagine a user reports that the model produced a response that appears to include a private customer detail, and you are not sure whether it was hallucinated or leaked from retrieval or training influence. Your control recall should include triage, containment, and evidence discipline, because you must treat potential privacy exposure as high urgency even before root cause is proven. You should recall containment levers like restricting retrieval scope, disabling certain data sources, reducing output verbosity, and limiting access to conversation history while investigation occurs. You should also remember that minimization and retention discipline reduce long-term exposure. So part of recovery may include reducing stored prompts and outputs that are not necessary. Another key recall is that versioning and provenance matter for investigation, because you need to know what model version, configuration, and data connectors were active when the output occurred. You also should recall that communication must be cautious and accurate, because privacy incidents carry obligations and overconfident statements can create additional harm. The rapid response is not to argue about whether it was real. It is to contain and investigate with structured evidence. When you can say, "We will treat this as potential leakage, contain data access, preserve evidence, and verify sources before restoring full capability," you are demonstrating mature lifecycle recall. Now retrieve a vendor-related scenario, because third-party models can change beneath you. Imagine the vendor announces an update, or you notice behavior shifts even without clear notice, and your monitoring shows changes in refusal patterns and output style. Your control recall should include the idea that vendor updates are still your risk, so you must validate behavior in your context and rerun your regression tests to confirm safety, privacy, and robustness did not degrade. You should also recall hidden dependencies, meaning the service may rely on subcomponents and sub-vendors that influence behavior, and those dependencies can change even if the product name stays the same. A practical control choice is to use governance gates for vendor updates, meaning updates are not rolled out broadly until evidence confirms they meet your requirements. You should also recall fallback modes, because if the update introduces risk, you need the ability to restrict capabilities or temporarily revert to a safer mode while working with the vendor. Another recall is that contracts matter operationally, because you need incident cooperation and change notice to be real, not just promised. When you can respond with, "We will treat this vendor update as a change event, rerun our regression and safety tests, and only then expand," you are practicing realistic risk management rather than brand-based trust. Now retrieve a retraining scenario, because retraining is often treated as the cure for every drift or complaint. Imagine a team says, "The model is getting worse, so let's retrain quickly using the latest user conversations, including raw customer prompts, to improve performance." Your control recall should immediately flag privacy, consent, and purpose limits, because using raw conversations for training can embed sensitive content into the model's influence, increasing leakage risk. You should also recall poisoning risk and labeling risk, because user-provided data can include manipulation and can reflect biased outcomes, which can degrade fairness and safety. A safer control choice is to gate retraining through governance, requiring data provenance approval, minimization, and clear criteria for what data is allowed and what must be excluded. You should also recall that retraining requires regression testing, because a retrained model can fix one failure while reintroducing another, such as reducing one hallucination pattern while increasing unsafe recommendations elsewhere. Rapid recall means you do not accept retraining as a reflex. You treat it as a high-impact change event. When you can say, "Retraining is possible, but only with approved data sources, strict minimization, provenance records, and regression testing against safety and privacy cases," you are demonstrating disciplined lifecycle control. Now retrieve the retirement stage, because many organizations leave risk behind when a system is supposedly done. Imagine a system is being replaced, and the team says, "We will just turn off access and move on." Your control recall should include data deletion, archiving, and lifecycle closure, because turning off access is not the same as removing data, revoking credentials, and disabling connectors. You should remember that sensitive data can exist in transcripts, logs, caches, and training artifacts, and retirement is the moment when the purpose for retaining much of that data ends. You should also recall that certain artifacts must be preserved for accountability, such as validation evidence, incident records, and approval records, but archiving should be selective and access-controlled so it does not become a new leak risk. Another key recall is that vendor closure matters, because third-party services may retain logs and data unless deletion commitments are executed and verified. Retirement also includes updating workflows so users do not continue using the old system informally. Rapid recall means you can say, "Retirement requires closure of data, access, integrations, and evidence, not just the user interface, and we must verify deletion and revocation actions." When you can respond that way without hesitation, you show lifecycle awareness that prevents ghosts of old systems from becoming future incidents. To strengthen rapid recall, Practice the internal question that ties all scenarios together. What control reduces harm fastest without creating a bigger hidden risk? In early design scenarios, harm reduction often means narrowing scope, setting purpose limits, and requiring cross-functional approval because prevention is cheapest. In data scenarios, harm reduction often means minimization, lineage, and classification because controlling data controls what the model can learn and reveal. In training and update scenarios, harm reduction often means reproducibility, versioning, governance gates, and regression testing because controlled change prevents regressions. In deployment and operation scenarios, harm reduction often means monitoring, rollback readiness, and safe mode fallbacks because surprises are inevitable. In adversarial and privacy scenarios, harm reduction often means containment levers, least privilege boundaries, and careful evidence handling because you must stop spread while preserving investigation capability. The same logic applies across the lifecycle, even though the surface details change. Your goal is to be able to articulate that logic clearly, because clarity is what convinces teams to act responsibly under pressure. When you can connect a control choice to a harm reduction principle, your decision becomes easier to defend and easier to execute. As we close, the purpose of this spaced retrieval review is to make lifecycle risk controls feel like ready-to-use instincts rather than ideas you only understand when reading calmly. You practiced recalling the lifecycle map, recognizing scenario patterns like drift, adversarial probing, privacy leakage, and vendor behavior shifts, and matching those patterns to control choices like minimization, provenance, governance gates, regression testing, monitoring, containment levers, and safe fallbacks. The deeper lesson is that AI risk management succeeds when control choices are made quickly and consistently at the right stage, not when they are invented during crisis. Rapid recall protects users because it reduces delay, and it protects organizations because it prevents confusion and contradictory action. If you can hear a scenario and immediately say what stage it touches, what risk is emerging, and what control choice is most direct, you're building the practical competence Domain 3 expects. Keep practicing this retrieval style because the payoff is not a perfect memory test score, but the ability to act wisely when time is short and consequences are real.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.